He held his phone with trembling hands, his eyes fixed on the screen while her message still pulsed through his mind, like an unfading echo. "I'll drop everything for you, just tell me when." The cold Boston wind bit his face, but what truly froze his chest was the certainty that he was ready to abandon his career, his friends, his stability, everything, to experience this love that had appeared like an unexpected storm. She was the risk he wanted to take, the leap into the dark that promised a light never before felt. And then the doorbell rang. The dry sound reverberated through the house, and with it, the presence of something that didn't match the sunny afternoon outside. When he opened the door, the figure standing before him seemed to carry in their hands not just an envelope, but the weight of a past he'd tried to bury. One look was enough to understand. Nothing would be the same after that moment. That visit didn't just bring news. It brought an ultimatum. The person he trusted. Most stood there, grave-faced, holding a truth that would shatter everything he thought he knew about the woman he swore he loved. The envelope, yellowed and creased, seemed too fragile to contain something capable of imploding an entire life. But its weight was unbearable. Inside it were not just words, but proof, dates, names, photographs that should never exist. And the moment the first images slipped out, he realized he wasn't the only man she'd promised to abandon everything to. Across town, she, unaware of what was to come, was writing another passionate message. His heart aching, he knew he had to decide, confront, forgive, or strike back with equal intensity. If this story is moving you, like and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. The afternoon light filtered through the house's tall windows, painting the walls with golden hues that seemed warmer than the air he breathed. In the background, the soft sound of a piano played on the record player, chosen purposefully to soothe the anxiety that, even so, insisted on spreading through his body. Sitting in the leather armchair, he swirled a glass of whiskey in his hands, watching the ripples of the liquid as if there might be some answer to the storm he was experiencing. On his cell phone screen, her name still glowed from her last message. The simple, almost innocent phrase hid a bold promise. "I'll drop everything for you. Just tell me when." It was the kind of declaration that could set any man on fire, but for him, it meant more than passion. It meant liberation. The life he'd led up until then was embalmed with commitments that didn't fulfill him, businesses that filled his bank account but emptied his soul. With her, he felt alive in a way he'd never imagined. He remembered the first time he'd seen her, a banal encounter in a corner coffee shop in New York. The way she laughed at a joke that wasn't even good, the way she held the cup with both hands, as if warming not just her fingers, but her entire heart. The romance blossomed quickly with discreet trips, late-night conversations, and stolen kisses in the rush of airports. He knew the risks, knew he was treading on shaky ground, but there was something about her that pulled him forward, like a current impossible to swim against. It wasn't just desire, it was the feeling that he'd finally found home in someone's gaze. So when he received that message, he didn't hesitate to believe that, yes, he could leave everything behind. And he was about to respond when a sound cut through the comfortable silence of the house, the doorbell. It was an ordinary afternoon in Boston, the sky clear, the wind light, but that doorbell ringing felt like a premonition. As he stood, his heart beat faster, not out of good anticipation, but out of a vague, uneasy premonition. The hallway seemed longer than usual, and with each step the feeling grew, as if something awaited him on the other side of the door, something that had not been part of his plans for that evening. As soon as he turned the doorknob, his world would begin to tear itself apart, and there was no turning back. When the door opened, his image appeared like an antique mirror held up to the present. Noah, the friend who had been with him through the sleepless nights of college, the quiet failures, the first promotion in Manhattan, the move to Boston. There were no hugs, just a tiny wave, and a silence that said this wasn't a visit. In his hand, the manila envelope folded at the corners carried a gravity that weighed down the entire room. He made room for Noah to enter. The smell of the street, mixed with distant rain, invaded the hallway, and suddenly the piano music seemed inadequate, as if playing to an audience that had already left. Noah placed the envelope on the coffee table and took a deep breath before speaking, looking not at his friend, but at their reflection in the window. He said he hadn't come as a friend, nor as a journalist, but as someone who couldn't bear to see him throw himself off a cliff with his eyes closed. His hands tore at the seal reluctantly, as if the glue itself could hold him in the time before the pain. The first photo slipped by, her smiling on a Charleston pier, a man's arm around her waist. Another in a Providence bar months ago, the same thin necklace around her neck, the same curve in her smile he swore was his alone. Then came a screenshot of emails with superimposed dates from secret trips they'd taken, a copy of a Nevada marriage certificate signed with a surname he'd never heard, and a string of messages in which the promise was almost the same. Only the order of the words changed. "I'll drop everything for you." The phrase that had ignited his courage was now gasoline on an open wound. He tried to breathe slowly, but his chest burned as if there was no air in the world, and the room felt cramped, filled with details he hadn't seen before. A crack in the baseboard, a loose wire on the armchair, cup marks on the wood. Noah spoke more quietly, explained how he'd arrived at this, the cross-referencing of data, the times, the witnesses, and asked if he wanted to hear the rest. He nodded because he wanted the whole truth, even if the truth pushed him against the wall. At the bottom of the envelope was a photo that hurt more than the others. Her on a Beacon Hill sidewalk, on a Sunday he remembered, the autumn light making her hair look copper. The man beside her held a coffee as she laughed, and in that laugh there was an intimacy that couldn't be improvised. He pressed his fingers to his temples, searching for stability in a spinning head, and had the cruel memory of another afternoon, years before, when he himself had chosen a contract over a love that waited for him for hours in a cafe. He left without explaining himself, certain that the world rewarded those who don't hesitate. An ancient shadow knocked on the door of memory. What if that were the exact return of what he once made someone feel because of him? I wanted to deny it. I wanted to blame Noah. I wanted to find a technicality that would turn the tide, but the clock on the wall marked a very clear second in which denial gave up. Her message, still open on his phone, flickered on the table, begging for a reply, promising a future that now had dust on its hinges. He didn't explode. He chose the coolness of control. He thanked Noah with a curt nod, asked him to leave him alone, and, when the door closed again, he walked to the window and let the icy wind bite his face. He thought about what passion demands and what truth demands, the difference between desire and destiny, and felt he couldn't bear being just another name in a string of promises. He picked up his phone, wrote that he needed to see her that night in Cambridge, in the restaurant where it had all begun without witnesses. He deleted, rewrote, kept the invitation simple, almost light, and pressed send with the calm of someone preparing a stage. If there were a precipice, he wouldn't be the only one with his eyes closed. The decision was born silently. He wouldn't ask for random explanations. He would offer her the chance to tell him who she was when the world was crying out for courage. And if courage didn't come, he would learn to give back to time what time had given him. Night fell over Boston like a heavy veil, muffling even the distant sound of traffic. He dressed unhurriedly, choosing a navy blue shirt that she always said highlighted his gaze, not out of vanity, but out of a calculated desire to keep every detail in her memory. As he fastened the buttons, he studied his reflection in the mirror, trying to find the same man who, hours before, had been ready to give up everything. He didn't. His face was the same, but there was something in his eyes, a weight that hadn't been there yesterday, a thin, sharp shadow. In the inside pocket of his jacket, he tucked a single sheet of paper. He'd removed from the evidence Noah had left, the photo of her on Beacon Hill. He wasn't sure if he would show it yet, but he wanted the power to decide at the right moment. He left the house, walking in the cold that sliced through the streets like blades, smelling the scent of fireplaces mingling with the food from the street corners. The Christmas lights were beginning to appear, giving the city an ironic beauty, as if the world insisted on appearing welcoming even when someone's heart was about to break. He arrived at the restaurant a little before his scheduled time, chose a table at the back facing the door, and ordered a bottle of wine. The waiter didn't notice anything unusual, but his posture was that of a man in a state of absolute anticipation, as if awaiting a verdict. When she entered, the room seemed to shift into focus. She wore a simple dress, but the way she walked drew attention. The smile she gave him was the same as always, the one that dissolved his arguments and convinced him that any madness was worth it. She sat down, placed her bag on the chair next to her, and asked in a light tone if he was okay. He said yes, but didn't rush into the reason for their meeting. He preferred to observe her, recording the details, like someone recording the final scene of a movie before the credits begin to roll. They talked about trivial things at first: work, the weather, a movie she wanted to see. He smiled and participated, but inside, every word she said was measured against the image in his pocket, until she touched his hand and said she'd thought about him a lot, that she'd dreamed of the day when everything could be simple. It was at that moment that he saw, behind the charm, the fine line where truth and lies met. He asked matter-of-factly where she'd been last Sunday. She blinked, slightly surprised, and said she'd visited a friend in Vermont. He nodded, smiled, but inside, something closed in. The lie slipped out of her with the ease of someone who'd practiced it before. He didn't confront her right away. He talked about their beginnings, about the coffee shop in New York, about how she'd changed his concept of home. She laughed, said she remembered every detail too. And then, when the wine was halfway finished and dinner was on its way, he pulled the photo from his pocket. He didn't hand it over. He simply placed it face up on the table. She looked at it, and her smile split in two. It wasn't a reaction of shock, but of calculation, the kind of pause where someone measures their next words with surgical precision. He noticed. The silence between them was no longer intimate, but trench-like. He said nothing for the first few seconds, and it was this silence that forced her to stare at her own image on the plate as if she might find a way out. She took a deep breath and said she could explain, that not everything was as it seemed, that Beacon Hill wasn't what he thought. He inclined his head gently, as if offering a clear field for the truth to flow. She asked, without raising her voice, if Vermont was really 2 blocks from Louisburg Square. She swallowed hard, and the waiter appeared like an unwitting savior with the wine, placing the glasses on the table with ceremonious care that only increased the discomfort. The background music changed to old jazz and seemed to mock them with an insolent elegance. She reached for the photo, but he stopped her with an almost imperceptible gesture. He said, "The photo wasn't the problem. Photos were always just snapshots of a time that decides to reveal itself. The problem was the line connecting that image to the 'I'll drop everything for you' messages sent like identical promises to different destinations." She pressed her lips together, thought about the script she prepared for emergencies, but realized he wasn't looking for the perfect version. He was looking for the honest stumble. She tried a sideways solution. She said the man was an old friend who had been through a bereavement, that she had exaggerated her closeness out of compassion. He nodded with an "I understand" that didn't signify agreement. It simply meant he was listening. And then, with an almost dangerous gentleness, he asked if compassion now came with a marriage certificate. The shock wasn't theatrical. It was that of someone who's been hit where they thought there was a wall. She closed her eyes for a moment and opened them as if returning from an internal negotiation. She said the marriage existed, but it was old, that it had been due to haste, fear, a document, everything and nothing, and that it was practically over. It needed to be signed. It lacked courage. He stirred the wine in his glass and tried to remember her first laugh, to see if the crack was still there. He thought of the coffee he'd abandoned years ago, of the woman who'd waited for him until late afternoon and received only silence in response. The world exacted interest on what we didn't return properly, and he saw this truth land on the table like a precisely folded napkin. He asked the man's name without souring his voice. She said Avery, and the name dropped between them like a coin on the counter. He asked how long it had been. She replied, "Too long." The waiter offered the main course and they accepted reflexively, as if eating could reorganize reality. While he cut the fish, he spoke of what he feared most. It wasn't the existence of another. It was the idea That for each man she pressed the same urgency button, the same text, the same flame. She denied it, saying that with him it was different, that love had a different weight, and for a second it seemed genuine, because certain phrases, when spoken with an open wound, lose their scent of deception. He believed that second, then let it pass, because seconds don't build bridges. He then said he wasn't there to punish her, but to choose what to do with it. He asked if she was ready to say everything. Now, without air gaps, without, "I'll explain later," without blaming the calendar. She lowered her eyes, touched the edge of the photo with her fingertip, and her phone vibrated inside her purse, a small, ignorable sound, but insistent. She didn't answer. It vibrated again. He didn't ask whose it was. He just watched the way her spine stiffened. On the third vibration, the name flashed across the screen before she could turn the screen. Avery. The air between them grew colder than the street. She cancelled the call like someone trying to put out a fire with their bare hands. She said she was working it out, that the past had deeper roots than she imagined, that sometimes life holds on by invisible threads. He replied that invisible wasn't the same as non-existent. He paid the bill with the decisiveness of someone closing a scene and suggested a walk to the Charles River, where the city seemed to hear better. On the way, side by side, she tried to touch his arm, but he kept his hands in her, his coat pockets, shielding himself from the wind and from a gesture that could break the last remaining limb. They stood at the water's edge, the reflected lights shimmering on the surface, and he said he would give her a chance he had once denied someone else, the chance to tell the whole story before history decided for them. She took a deep breath and began to say what she had never said before, while across town, someone left a voicemail with the kind of truth that doesn't wait for permission to be born. Her voice began trembling, as if she were choosing each word with the delicacy of someone handling broken glass. She said she met Avery before any promises were made to him, at a time when she believed the security of a bond was worth more than freedom. The marriage hadn't been born of intense love, but of a mixture of fear and convenience, something to keep life from swallowing her whole. Over time, she realized she'd enclosed herself in a gilded cage, and it was in this space of half-open doors that he appeared. He spoke as if retelling a script she'd reviewed 1,000 times in her head, but there were passages that escaped her control. Small hesitations, abrupt silences, a glance that strayed. He didn't interrupt. The river wind blew cold, bringing the metallic smell of water and the distant sound of a saxophone lost in the street. She confessed she'd tried to break up with Avery more than once, but he always found a way to pull her back, using secrets she didn't want revealed. That didn't absolve her, and she seemed to know it, but it did paint a darker picture of the man on the other end of the line. He listened to everything with a serenity that disconcerted her. There were no outbursts or direct accusations, just that deep, attentive gaze that dismantled any defenses. When she finished, she sensed there was more, but perhaps that more was a precipice she dared not describe. He finally asked if the "I'll drop everything for you" he'd received was true or just a phrase recycled from previous promises. She took her time, took a deep breath, and said that with him it would be different, that this time she was ready to face the consequences. He nodded, but something inside him was already decided. Promises are only valuable when they are born before the trials, not after. They remained silent for a few moments, watching a lit boat slowly cross the river. In the reflection of the water, the lights distorted, like refracted truths. He thought of how many times he had chosen not to see obvious signs, carried by the euphoria of feeling alive. And almost like an internal whisper, he recognized that this situation carried a karmic weight. Years before, he himself had left someone trapped in a promise they would never keep, lacking the courage to break it honestly. Now it was the other side of the coin, burning his hands. She tried to take his arm, begging him not to let an unresolved past kill something so rare. But he offered no guarantees. He simply said that the next day they would be in the same place at the same time, and that if she wanted to prove the truth of her words, she would bring evidence, not explanations. Courage isn't spoken, it's shown, he added, looking at the horizon where the city's glow blended with the darkness of the night. She agreed, though the gleam in her eyes betrayed that doing so might be more difficult than it seemed. He then walked away, walking slowly through the darkness, feeling that each step brought him closer to an answer and further away from the version of himself that believed he was in control. The early morning was short and harsh, and he didn't sleep. He just closed his eyes to arrange his pieces like a chess player who needs to see the entire board before moving a pawn. At 5, the city still breathed steam through the building's air vents, and he walked to a coffee shop in Kendall Square to experience the taste of beginning that mornings sometimes bring. His phone vibrated with an automated voicemail transcription from an unknown number. The voice, harsh and impatient, said Avery's name and asked him to "don't do anything stupid, that no one needs to know." There was anger disguised as caution, and at the end a warning that sounded like a polite threat. "We'll sign when I say so." He listened again, this time with headphones on, and noticed the background noise of televisions on, an electronic doorbell, quick footsteps, perhaps a hotel lobby. Made a mental note of the detail and sent the recording to Noah, who responded within minutes with a dry promise to track down the source. The entire day fit into a waiting game. He worked mechanically, answered emails with the discipline of someone who doesn't want to think, and had a random lunch near South Station, where people always seem to be in transit to other lives. In the afternoon, Noah returned a point. The number on the message came from a hotel in Back Bay, booked 2 days ago with a corporate card from a consulting firm linked to Avery. The piece fit an uncomfortable direction. It wasn't just a tired marriage, it was a control structure, a web built with receipts, trips, and doors that closed from within. He didn't feel relief. He felt the gravity of what it meant to love someone who was perhaps surviving more than choosing. When the clock struck 6, he walked back to the Charles River, deciding to wait on the same wooden bench. The cold bit his ears and brought to the surface old memories that never ask for permission. The woman he'd abandoned at the Tribeca Cafe, her eyes waiting for a no that never came, the message he never sent. Karma doesn't use dates, it uses mirrors. He grabbed his phone and, without thinking too much, wrote to that past a brief apology, offering no justification, simply admitting his cowardice. He didn't expect a response. The act itself was like stepping outside the circle. She arrived a few minutes before the scheduled time, breathing quickly, as if she'd run from the station. There was no calculated makeup, no dress that demanded applause. There was urgency. She sat next to him, not across from him, and pulled from her bag an envelope different from Noah's, thin, unadorned, with folded papers and a flash drive. She said, almost in a whisper, that this was all she'd gathered in one day: copies of emails demanding she signed the divorce papers, conversations with her sister asking for shelter, an old letter in which Avery promised to understand if she wanted to leave, as long as she took nothing but her clothes with her. The flash drive contained recordings of 2 recent conversations, recorded with the cell phone in her pocket, in which his voice sounded like cold iron. He didn't look for heroism in her eyes. He looked for consistency. He asked her exactly what she wanted from now on, without poetry, without dramatization. She replied that she wanted freedom before love, and that if he couldn't or wouldn't walk with her through the process, she would understand. It was the first sentence that didn't beg. It asked for dignity. He took a deep breath and felt something shift inside an old groove, as if a rusty gear had given way. He said there were 2 simple conditions: no lies from now on, and a gesture that wouldn't depend on him, a verifiable step she could take alone. She nodded and, with a trembling hand, showed her phone screen with an email she'd sent an hour earlier to a lawyer in Cambridge requesting formal entry into the dissolution process. The automated response confirmed receipt. The wind lifted her hair, and for a moment the city disappeared behind a long roar of bridge and water. He told her about Avery's message from Back Bay and saw fear cross her face like a cloud shadow. He said he had no interest in a small war, but that no war is avoided by feigning peace. He would do what he could, record it, preserve it, deliver it to the rightful owner. He would be neither shield nor sword. He would be a witness. And as a witness, he chose to walk with her to the hotel. They walked up Boylston with steps that tried to appear ordinary, crossed against the light with a haste disguised as idle conversation, and entered the overlit lobby of a building where everything smelled of new carpet. At the counter, a clerk with a professional smile confirmed, without confirming, that Avery was staying. The elevator said the rest with the leap of numbers. In the hallway, the carpet swallowed the sound of their footsteps, and he felt her hand searching for the edge of her coat as if searching for ground. They knocked once. Silence. They knocked again. The door opened with the calculated slowness of someone weighing losses before admitting guests. Avery had the neutral elegance of those camouflaged in power, a white shirt, rolled-up sleeves, the expensive watch telling him the time was his. The scene didn't explode. It dragged on. He spoke first, introducing himself without memorizing titles, explaining that he was there because things that need to be resolved shouldn't continue to be hidden behind screens. Avery laughed toothlessly, a curve of the mouth that doesn't need sound to offend, and said that this was a couple's matter. She lifted her chin and, in a voice that even her surprise recognized as firm, said she would file for divorce with or without politeness, that she had sufficient evidence and that she would export it to whoever needed it. Avery stopped laughing mid-laugh as if finding an unexpected piece on the board, and looked at him, searching for the scoop. There wasn't one. He didn't threaten, didn't promise. He simply placed the flash drive on the dresser and said he preferred everything to remain civilized. Avery measured the silence, took a half-step back, and closed the door with a promise to call the lawyers. In the elevator back, she slumped against the metal sides and let out a nervous laugh that sounded like tears. He leaned his head back, tired, lacking any heroes in himself, and understood that the journey would be long, but that the first gesture had already been made without asking for applause. As they stepped out onto the street, Boston felt the same cold, but not the same air. Sometimes the world doesn't change, only the posture of those who cross it. He shoved his hands in his pockets, ready to learn the difference. In the days that followed, everything seemed too quiet, as if the city had decided to watch the story unfold from afar. He returned to his routine with restrained movements, avoiding excessive chatter at work, responding only when necessary, and using each break to mentally organize what might still happen. She, on the other hand, seemed to carry a new weight, not that of Avery's fear, but of uncertainty about what would remain of her once the dust settled. They exchanged short messages, quick meetings, no declarations, no plans. It was as if they both knew they were crossing a narrow bridge, and any wrong step could bring them down. Noah stayed close, sending discreet news. Avery had begun moving accounts. Some contacts in the legal field were talking about a lawsuit that could become public if anyone wanted. He understood the message. His adversary wasn't just a man with wounded pride. He was someone who knew how to use influence like a silent knife. Still, there was no turning back. On a chilly Saturday afternoon, she asked him to meet her at a small cafe near Harvard Square. The place was warm, lined with old books on the shelves, the kind of atmosphere that seemed to suspend time. She looked different, with her hair tied back simply, and a look that mixed weariness with determination. She asked him to sit down, handed him a thin folder, and told him that it contained the signed copy of the divorce petition filed that morning. The document bore the official seal, the dates, the signatures, and seemed heavier than the paper should allow. He leafed through it slowly, absorbing not only the formality of the gesture but its symbolic dimension. For the first time, she was cutting a rope she'd previously used as an excuse. He felt a silent respect, but didn't put it into words. This wasn't a time for celebration. It was time to watch their next move. As they talked, he noticed a man sitting at the counter, looking in their direction with calculated insistence. He wasn't a regular customer. He had the demeanor of someone not there for the coffee. When the stranger left, he dropped a small envelope under their table. He picked it up, opened it carefully, and found inside only a black and white photograph. He and she, sitting exactly as they had been at that moment, but captured from the outside, as if someone had been watching them from a distance for longer than they realized. On the back, handwritten, was a short sentence. Nothing truly ends. The handwriting was firm, almost elegant, but there was no signature. She paled as she read it, and he realized it wasn't from Avery. It was older, more subterranean, something she might not have even told him. She tried to downplay it, saying it was probably some trivial provocation, but the way she clasped her hands in her lap said otherwise. He didn't press the point. He pocketed the photo and changed the subject, talking about the snow that was beginning to fall outside, about how Boston seemed slower at times like these. As he dropped her off, he noticed the street looked different with a car parked on the other side, its tinted windows reflecting the lights. He didn't comment, but he memorized the license plate. When she got in and closed the door, he stood on the sidewalk for a few minutes, staring at the windows, until the car slowly drove away. That night alone, he took the photo from his pocket and examined it carefully. The angle indicated that the person taking the photo was very close, perhaps in the cafe itself, and the clarity showed it wasn't just any cell phone. It signified preparation, intention. The phrase on the back, "Nothing truly ends," rang like an omen. He knew Avery had reason to be vigilant, but the invisible signature behind that threat seemed to have been written by another person, and his instincts told him that deep down, this new player had nothing to do with love or jealousy, but with something that predated even the day they met. He spent the next morning examining the photograph against the lamplight, trying to decipher the grain, the distance, the height of the capture point. It didn't look like an amateur's work. At 7, he found Noah at a diner on Mass Ave, that raw, early morning light hitting the chrome tables. His friend brought the photo close to his eyes, frowned, and said he knew the style, black and white, 400 film and old lens. People who like to leave a trace of authorship. They took the image to a contact of his at the newspaper, someone who would recognize a trace by the smell of developer. While they waited, he walked to the Harvard Square Cafe where it had all happened, showed the manager the envelope left on the floor, and asked about cameras. There were indeed 2, one inside, one on the sidewalk. The manager, with a mixture of curiosity and caution, offered to see the recordings if he brought a formal request. He called Noah. 2 hours later, Noah brought a simple document, enough for a quick look. On the screen, the flow of customers flowed like a river of ordinary faces until a man in a long coat and fedora leaned against the counter, ordered something quickly, and turned his face to the lens unhurriedly, as if greeting an old friend. The external camera caught the exit. The same man stood in the window, took a thin envelope from his pocket, waited for the exact moment they stood up, walked behind, dropped the envelope, and didn't look back. A practiced gesture. There was something, however, that stirred a deep unease. The way the man held the camera hanging around his neck, an old Leica identical to the one he'd seen years ago in a Tribeca apartment, propped up on books. Back then, it belonged to the woman he'd left waiting at the cafe. His heart raced, not from resurrected love, but from pattern recognition. Was it coincidence, or had life decided to sew up loose ends he'd pretended not to see? Back at the diner, Noah's contact called. The grain signature and contrast suggested the laboratory of a small collective in Somerville. People who still develop on trays. They took a car and drove there. The place smelled of chemicals and had bare concrete walls. A man with a short beard and silver-stained hands greeted them with a humor that couldn't stand direct questions. Noah showed the photo. The man studied the texture for a moment and said, without taking his eyes off it, "Whoever developed this likes to write on the back with a blue fountain pen." He swallowed hard. Tucked away in a box of old letters was a note from years ago in the same blue ink, the same pressure on the writing signed with a single initial, L. That night, already home, he opened the box he'd been avoiding since moving to Boston. Among the clippings and letters, he found the note from L, the woman from the Tribeca coffee shop. "Nothing truly ends, it just changes shape." The phrase on the back of the photo was a near verbatim variation, written with the same slant. The past, which he thought buried, knocked on his door with photographer's gloves. Before he could decide what it meant, his intercom rang. The doorman informed him there was an envelope for him with no return address. In the elevator, the mirror revealed a face too tired for further enigmas. In the envelope, another black and white photo, now just him alone at the edge of the Charles, gazing at the water as if searching for a map. On the back, another sentence, "Choosing is also wounding." He felt the silent blow of a truth he had always avoided. When he departed without warning, he left behind someone torn apart by the same kind of silence that now terrified him. He called Noah, told him about the letters, about the initial L, and heard from his friend a caution that wasn't just journalistic. Beware of what seems like too much of a coincidence. Still, he decided to write to L, an email he had kept in drafts for years, like a request for forgiveness without an addressee. He wasn't seeking reunion. He was seeking closure. The cursor blinked. He typed a few lines, attached the photo of the coffee and asked if it was hers. The reply came within minutes, short, pointed. "It wasn't me, but I know who uses my words whenever they want you to listen." Before he could reply, another message arrived from an unnamed email address with a sequence of 6 recent photos. Him and her crossing Boylston Street, her at the coffee counter, him opening the envelope in the diner, Avery at a hotel window talking on the phone. At the end, the same blue letter, "Someone always pays the price for not knowing what they want." He realized with a shiver that authorship no longer mattered as much as intention, to drive him to a decision out of emotional exhaustion. This wasn't love from anyone, it was control. And when the phone vibrated again, it was Avery's voice, clear on speakerphone, that confirmed his suspicion. "Do you really think you were the first one photographed?" Avery laughed softly, humorlessly. "Sometimes the best weapon is a mirror." He hung up without a response. The night stretched on like a long corridor. He gathered the photos, sorted the letters, locked everything in a folder, and, for the first time since the beginning, knew the way out wouldn't come from figuring out who pressed the shutter, but from choosing which side he'd be on when the flash went off again. And he decided. The next day, before taking any steps, he would return to the Harvard Square Cafe with her by his side, request the official images, record everything. He would no longer let unsigned notes dictate the script of his life. If Karma was writing in blue ink, he would respond with an unerasable gesture. They returned to the Harvard Square Cafe in the early morning, she beside him, her face tense as glass before the flash. The manager led them to a makeshift office in the back, where a large screen showed life in high resolution, trays coming and going, coats hanging, winter creeping in through the cracks. Noah arrived soon after, bringing a drive and the objectivity of someone who knows that the truth on video hurts but liberates. They pressed play. The man in the long coat appeared at 10:14, ordered something short, paid in cash, and stayed. The tiny movement of dropping the envelope was as precise as the slamming of a door that doesn't creak. From another angle, the external camera showed a detail the first had missed. Across the street, someone was taking pictures not with a cell phone, but with a Leica hanging from an old strap. The hand holding the camera had a scar across the knuckles, a clear diagonal line. The focus alternated for just enough seconds to imprint the image on everyone's memory. He didn't recognize that hand. It, however, paled in a different way, like someone recognizing an ancient threat that has returned to speak another language. He didn't give the name. He simply said, "It's from long ago," and without looking at anyone, asked to keep watching. They moved on. At 10:21, the man with the envelope came out, looked at the window with their reflections, and in an almost theatrical gesture, lifted his chin to the camera as if signing a painting. The manager printed the payment record, an unmarked note, no bank, nothing but the exact amount and a handwritten "thank you" in blue ink. Noah photographed the receipt, saved the video, and the trio left the cafe feeling as if the street corner had begun to right itself. Outside, thin snow fell like dust from an old movie. They crossed to the bookstore across the street, searching for a familiar face. The clerk stroked his beard and said the man in the coat sometimes came by, bought photography magazines and blank postcards. He paid in cash. He didn't talk. Every now and then he would leave a phrase copied onto a small piece of paper he collected on the counter. "Nothing truly ends. Choosing is also hurting. The best lie feels like a promise." The pages had the same slant of handwriting, the same blue ink that was already etching his nerves. As they left the bookstore, a man in a dark suit approached, asking them to confirm their names. His voice was the smooth, unvarnished voice of someone who makes bad announcements every day. He handed them 2 envelopes, a formal notice from Avery requesting a restraining order to prevent her from leaving the marital home with property or documents, and another with a subpoena for him, demanding that he not interfere in marital matters. It was the legal battle beginning, even before a gunshot. She took a deep breath like someone holding back tears in the presence of strangers. He simply nodded, put the notices in his pocket, and decided the answer would come in the open light, not in the hallways. Noah suggested going to the Somerville Print Processing Collective to see if any names would come up. On the way, the traffic over the bridge seemed to be pushing and pulling fates. The lab smelled of fixative and iron. A technician with stained hands recognized the contrast agent's signature and said that a regular customer, always polite and always anonymous, developed small batches on Fridays. He paid cash, left-handed, with scars on his fingers. He didn't leave negatives, didn't leave an email address, but sometimes he bought old postcards and repeated that the back is where the truth lies. The technician didn't know the name, but he remembered a habit. Every time he went out, he'd stop by a specific stand in Porter Square first to buy a fountain pen. Blue. Upon returning, he realized that the pieces already formed a clear message, even though the author hid behind beautiful gestures. Someone wanted their story to be kept private. Someone wanted to drag them into the square, force them to choose under the spotlight. There was in it the same script he once wrote without realizing it. When he abandoned Elle in the cafe, it wasn't just love that refused. It was the courage to embrace in the sunlight what, in the shadows, seemed safe. Karma. Patient repeats phrases until a person learns to respond differently. The next day, he and she went together to the Cambridge courthouse to file their answers. No hiding their hands. They climbed the stone stairs, passed the detector, smelled the paper and old decisions. Outside, before entering, he extended his hand, and it took her half a second to accept, not out of pride, but out of fear of promising something with a gesture. When their fingers touched, there was no music, no epiphany. There was only the mature sensation of placing herself for the first time on the bright side of the chessboard. A photographer in the distance raised his Leica. The shutter flashed a short sound. He looked in the direction of the flash and, for the first time, didn't look away. If they wanted mirrors, they would see the entire reflection. And as they walked through the heavy courthouse doors, he knew that the story, from then on, would no longer be about those watching from afar, but about what they would do when no one was looking. Inside the courtroom, time seemed to pass differently, as if each second carried the weight of an irreversible decision. The cold marble reflected echoing footsteps, and the air smelled thickly of old paper mixed with the cheap perfume of long corridors. They sat side by side, awaiting roll call, with a minimal distance between their bodies, enough so that no one would mistake presence for possession. She held a folder containing the divorce documents, but her fingers betrayed the tension. They tapped lightly on the cover, as if counting an invisible beat. He, for his part, kept his hands on his knees, breathing slowly, so that each inhale felt like an act of self-control. When her name was announced, they stood together. The judge, a grey-haired man with a weary expression, watched them with eyes that revealed he'd seen all manner of drama disguised as formality. Avery wasn't present, but her lawyer, a slow-talking man with a fake smile, seemed determined to turn the proceedings into a spectacle. He began by questioning her sudden urgency to formalize the divorce, insinuating outside pressure and undeclared interests. She kept her gaze steady, responding with short, clear sentences. The lawyer then mentioned individuals who photograph and circulate cryptic messages, suggesting that this could influence the case. At that moment, his heart skipped a beat. It was no coincidence that this detail had reached the defense table. Noah, sitting in the back, took quick notes and exchanged discreet glances with him. When the judge interrupted his attempt to turn the hearing into an interrogation, the atmosphere returned to a cool neutrality. When he left, the hallway was silent, but the tension vibrated like a taut string. A man leaning against the wall holding an open newspaper looked up and followed them with his gaze. He said nothing, but the way he folded the paper and tucked it under his arm betrayed his eagerness to be noticed. As they passed him, something fell to the floor, an old postcard yellowed with age. He bent down to pick it up and noticed that on the back was written a phrase he already knew: "What you don't fix repeats itself." The ink was blue. They stepped out onto the street where the wind was like a blade. She was pale, but there was a new determination in her eyes, as if she'd finally realized she was no longer running for cover from Avery, but from a shadow with no defined face. He tucked the card into his pocket, deciding they wouldn't discuss it there in the middle of the sidewalk. They walked to a small restaurant on the corner, where Noah was already waiting. They sat down and spread out on the table all the objects they'd collected over the past few days: photos, cards, receipts, documents. The pattern was there, hidden in the sequence. Each note, each image, each phrase carried an echo of the past, but also an attempt to shape the present. Noah suggested that perhaps it wasn't just a personal matter. There were signs that someone was using their story as a test case, an experiment to see how intimate decisions warp under constant surveillance. The theory seemed absurd, but it fit with the meticulous precision of the events, the chosen moments for the photographs, the repetition of phrases laden with implicit morals, the calculated use of familiar figures. He listened silently, but inside, his knot tightened. If this were true, this wasn't just about closing a door, it was about understanding who was really holding the doorknob. As they argued, her phone vibrated. An unsent message appeared on the screen. "It's not about love, it's about courage." Alongside it was a photo taken at that very moment, from outside the restaurant window, capturing the three of them sitting at the table. He stood up suddenly and ran out into the street, but the block was empty, except for a fleeting glimpse of a long coat turning the corner. When he returned, he found a napkin on his plate that hadn't been there before. On it, written in the familiar blue ink, "Courage is the ultimate test, not long now." He realized with an almost physical chill that history was about to turn a dangerous corner, and that the final decision wouldn't just be about staying or going, loving or leaving, but about facing the mirror that time had been holding before his face since the first broken promise. He tucked the napkin into his pocket, but the weight of those words seemed to burn through the fabric. The chill of the street faded as they left the restaurant, but the air felt denser, as if the city had shrunk in size and every corner was a vantage point. Noah followed a few steps behind, alert, as they crossed onto Boylston Street. As they approached the same corner where days before he had seen the reflection of a long coat, a figure emerged from the shadows between two closed storefronts. There was no more theater. It was the man from the photographs. Wool coat. Felt had pulled down to his eyebrows, the lycra slung across his chest, swaying slightly with the movement of his body. He didn't run, didn't flee. He stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, raising his camera as if inviting someone to take a portrait. The sharp click of the shutter broke the silence, and he found himself, for the first time, facing the act without protecting himself. He took 2 steps forward and asked what the man wanted. The answer came in an almost cordial tone. "For you to finish what you started." There was no anger, no rush, just the confidence of someone who already knows the other person's reaction before even hearing the question. She approached, her breathing fast, and firmly told him to stop, that she didn't know what was causing it. The man inclined his head slightly and replied, "I know exactly. It's what you haven't learned yet that keeps me here." Then she took something from her pocket, not a gun, but a stack of developed photos. She handed it to him without resistance. At the top, an old image, the Tribeca coffee shop, the same afternoon he'd left without warning, captured from an impossible angle. Then recent photos, he and she in court, talking by the Charles, entering the hotel to confront Avery. Each had a different phrase on the back, but all signed with the same initial L. His blood seemed to slow. He looked into the man's eyes and understood that it wasn't L, but someone who had inherited his words or stolen them to build a game of their own. He asked why, and the answer was simple: because only under pressure do you show your true colors, and you haven't shown it yet. Noah approached and in a quick movement took a photo with his cell phone. The man didn't react, just smiled with his eyes. Then he put away his Leica, turned his back and disappeared around the corner as if he had just completed a routine. They stood there for a few seconds, as if the cold had glued their feet to the ground. When they started walking, again Noah showed them the photo he'd taken. The man's face was partially obscured by the brim of his hat, but the scar on his knuckles was clear. And there was something else. In the background, reflected in the glass of a shop window, Avery stood, watching from a few feet away. There was no way of knowing if he'd seen the entire encounter or if he'd been part of it from the beginning. Back at the apartment, the atmosphere was one of silent war. They spread the new photos on the table, forming a line that stretched from Tribeca to Boston, passing through every crucial moment of his life. It was impossible to deny the choreography, every step observed, every decision provoked. She sat on the couch, hugging her knees, and said it felt like they were living inside a movie they hadn't written. He didn't respond. He just looked out the window and saw his own reflection in the darkness of the glass. For the first time, he felt that perhaps he wasn't just reacting, but being led to an ending. Someone had already chosen. And in the silence that followed, he realized that the next move would have to be his, not to win the game, but to break the board. He turned off all the lights in the apartment and deliberately stayed in the dark until his eyes learned to draw things from memory again. The sound of the heater sounded like a heart trying not to lose its beat. He took a regular pen, not blue, and hand-wrote a single page. A chronology without adjectives, without defense, without embellishment. Tribeca, the cafe, the cowardly silence, Boston, the promise to drop everything, Avery, the Leica, the notes. He signed it with his own name, in full, and sent Noah a photo of the page with a short sentence. If anyone publishes, let them start with me. Then he forwarded the same document to Elle, without asking for forgiveness, without asking for anything back, just offering what he had owed for years, a complete truth. Then he wrote to her, "Tomorrow, 5 p.m., steps of Louisburg Square. Bring nothing but yourself. The rest I'll take." In the morning he hurried across Charles, stopped at the Somerville Photo Processing Center, and bought a simple frame. He asked the technician to print a single photo, not the one watching him, nor the one of Beacon Hill with another man, but the image of the two of them from behind, captured by chance in the cafe footage, when they still didn't know they were being watched. "Make it with a wide border," he said. "I need to remember that there's silence around every story." On the way, he stopped at an antique shop on Cambridge Street and bought an old tape recorder, the kind with thin tape and large buttons, because sometimes truth needs noise to exist before those who only trust what clicks. Before 4, he stopped by the office of a lawyer Noah had recommended, handed over the evidence, filed a restraining order for her, and formally recorded the messages and photographs. "Do you want to make it public?" "I want to make it clear." The lawyer explained the risks, and he agreed with them all. He left with the heavy folder of papers that now bore stamps, not just wounds. He bought 2 paper cups at a kiosk and stood for a few minutes watching the water lazily advance beneath Longfellow. He promised himself to cross that bridge one last time without looking back. At 4:47 p.m., she stood on the brick corner, the low gold of a cold afternoon dripping down the facades of Beacon Hill. She arrived without makeup, her hair hastily tied back, and her coat open as if she didn't have enough hands to hold her chest. He didn't approach in a hurry. He handed her the frame, and it took her a while to understand that this was the first photo of them that hadn't been stolen from someone. "If we continue, let it be like this, turning our faces toward the pointer, but without turning toward each other." She smiled with a new fear and said she was there, even if nothing was guaranteed. He nodded and showed her the stamped folder, the measurements, the signatures, the tape recorder. "Today we don't rush. Today the city listens to us." The man in the long coat appeared at the foot of the stairs as if he had always known the time. He didn't raise his Leica. He watched. It was almost worse. He took 2 steps forward, removed the recorder from his pocket, and placed it on the railing, pressing the button with a click that squared the air. Enough letters. "Speak." The man leaned in, but said nothing. A cross. The square. Avery appeared with the calculated haste of someone who knows that arriving a minute late is also a strategy. The triangle had finally formed in the sun, without corridors, without storefronts, without glass. Noah, hidden enough not to spoil the scene and visible enough to protect his place in history, positioned his cell phone and took a breath. Avery tried to start with irony, but found herself at a loss. She held up the formal document and said, with a firmness she hadn't recognized in herself for years, that she would no longer argue with internal doors, nor with photographs, nor with those who signed with someone else's initials. If the world needs to see, it will. But I'm not coming back. The man in the coat laughed silently and raised his Leica a foot just to say he could. He took a step, standing between the lens and her, and for the first time understood that the gesture wasn't that of a savior horse, but of a debtor learning to pay. You're here because of me, she told the photographer without anger, because one day I took the shortcut, and shortcuts always take a toll. He then took the postcard from his pocket that read, "What you don't resolve repeats itself," and, with a calm, practiced all night, turned the back to Noah's camera, then to the man's empty eyes and tore it in half, not as if destroying evidence, but as if inaugurating new material. He pulled the transparent tape from the recorder, glued the two halves together with a visible seam, a scar on the paper. Things continue, he said, but they also change shape when someone decides to stop running. The wind dislodged a dry leaf down the stairs, and for the first time, no one moved to erase it from the scene. Avery, without a stage, grew smaller. She muttered something about lawyers, but the words lost weight in the air. The man with the Leica lowered the camera, as if it had forgotten its function. "What's the final test?" she asked, and her voice no longer trembled. He answered without looking at anyone but her, "Being truthful when no one needs to prove you're lying." The photographer nodded, strangely satisfied, as if this were the picture he'd been searching for all along. Not someone's downfall, but the exact moment someone chooses. Noah approached slowly, touched his shoulder, and pointed to the tape recorder spinning like a small beacon. The city breathed around them with the sound of a bus braking below, a dog barking at the iron gate, a bell that wasn't there, or maybe it always was. There was no victory, there was an axis. He looked at the frame in her hands and knew that, from now on, everything that came would happen under the same sun that now flooded the square. And on the man in the coat's face, something resembling respect appeared. The scarred hand took a step back and the shutter, for the first time, chose not to sound. The square became a street again, and they descended the steps with the gravity of someone carrying a fragile object. Inside, the man in the coat vanished like mist. Avery dissolved into promises to lawyers, and Noah stayed behind on the phone, letting the world record that the truth, when it arrives, doesn't ask for permission. They walked aimlessly down Beacon Hill until they found an empty bench, where the night was beginning to light up windows and stories. He rested the frame on her lap and remained silent for a while, listening only to the tape recorder finish its rotation with a timid click. It was then that he spoke, with the voice he'd rarely used his entire life, the voice of someone who assumes, not one who explains. He told her that his love for her had learned a lesson late, and that, therefore, he needed to choose the gesture that would break the cycle, not promising to give up everything but to give it all back. "Freedom before us," he said, and the "before" hung in the air like a proper noun. She looked at him with eyes that understood the price and, for the first time since the beginning, agreed without asking for guarantees. It wasn't a breakup, it was an ethical retreat. He would accompany her through the process, hold all the heavy doors, but he wouldn't rush into the new house. Karma, to close, demanded that no one be used as a bridge. A gust of wind brought a piece of paper to their feet. He bent down and recognized the blue ink on the back. When someone stays, another stops running. There was no signature. He smiled, not with irony, but with recognition. The game only breaks when the piece refuses the board. The next morning, he took the train to New York with a manila envelope and an unfamiliar calm. He got off at Canal Street, walked to the Tribeca coffee shop where ancient history had frozen, and waited at the counter like someone returning an overdue book. Elle didn't show up, and that was part of the deal. The apology didn't require an audience. He left the frame of the mended card with the manager, a copy of the page he'd written the night before, and a simple note. "This time I'm done." As he left, he saw a reflection he recognized in the window. The man with the Leica from across the street, hatless. The scar on his fingers remained a clean line. He crossed, took 2 steps closer, and simply said, "Thank you." The other inclined his head, almost a greeting, and returned a thin envelope. Inside, a single negative. Him standing in front of the camera, his body between the lens and it, his hand holding the torn card. On the back, still written in blue, a phrase that was neither a threat nor a lesson. "Now you know how to stay." There was no goodbye. The man put the camera away and walked in the opposite direction, as photographers do when the scene ends. Back in Boston, he and she went to the courthouse together again, not holding hands but on the same side. The hearing passed without a spectacle, and the lawyer explained that if Avery insisted on prolonging the war, there would be enough deadlines and lights to tire. The ruse. As she left, she rested her head on his shoulder, a brief gesture without promise. He understood and stepped away gently, letting that head learn to rest on its own first. That night at home, he opened the window and listened to the winter like someone listening to a grandfather clock. In the email, 2 messages. One from Noah confirming that the evidence had been recorded, another from Elle with a photo of the empty coffee shop and a single line, "Now it ends without an audience." He responded with a "thank you," which was the most complete sentence he had ever written. He put the negative in a folder, next to the framed photo of the 2 of them back to back, the only image they chose to keep. Days later, without pink slips, without cameras in the distance, they met for a simple coffee in Kendall Square. They talked about the process, work, books. In the end, she told him she'd started looking for a smaller apartment near the river to fit her new life into what she truly needed. He smiled, paid the bill, and didn't promise anything. He offered time. As they said goodbye, she asked if the fear of losing her haunted him. He said yes, but that the real fear now was losing himself again in the mirror. She nodded, and the hug they shared didn't need a caption. On the sidewalk, a tourist raised a random camera and snapped carelessly. The shutter cut through the air, and no one moved, because there was nothing left to hide. He looked at the pool of light on the asphalt and realized the true twist. It wasn't about figuring out who was taking the photos, but choosing who would be when no one was taking them. Karma, at last, had switched languages, and as he walked home alone, he realized that he was, for the first time, entirely within his own image. If this story touched you, just imagine what's about to happen in the next chapter. There are secrets yet to be revealed, decisions that change destinies, and a detail that could transform everything you think. About trust. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the moment the next truth comes to light.